In this video, we are talking about 8 sneaky starts and scary sits in week 10 of fantasy football. But before we get into it, if you can please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you do end up enjoying. Starting with the sneaky starts, first guy up is Joan Jennings, who is finally set to return after missing the last 2 games with that hip injury. And then San Francisco had that bye week in week 9, so you haven't really been able to play him, but he needs to be in starting lineups, especially if you spent all that fab in order to get him on your roster. And don't forget, this is a really good receiver. I think he's one of the more underrated receivers in football. And heading into week 8, this was a guy that ranked 3rd in yards per route run, 4th in PPR points per route run, which was only behind guys like Nico Collins, Justin Jefferson, and Chris Godwin, along with a passer rating of 138.3 when targeted, which ranks 3rd among all receivers. I think Jennings has a massive opportunity in front of him with Brandon Ayuk out for the year, as we know, and has an easy matchup against the Bucs, who have allowed the 3rd most passing yards per game and 6th most passing touchdowns. No team has allowed more yards on slot targets than the Buccaneers, and that's important because Jennings has run more than half of his routes from the slot this year. I also expect San Francisco to be in scoring position a lot more often now that Christian McCaffrey is presumably going to be back into the lineup in week 10. I'd be starting Joan with confidence this week. I think he's kind of flying under the radar just because he hasn't played in a while, but this is still a really good player on a really good offense that's going to get opportunities with Ayuk out for the rest of the season. And like I said, I think the 49ers are going to be able to move the football a little more effectively on offense now that Christian McCaffrey's back. So if you need a wide receiver 3 or someone to throw into your flex, I think Jennings has a really nice game in week 10. Next guy up is Rome Odunze, who is coming off his 2nd best fantasy performance in week 9. 5 catches, 104 yards on 7 targets, 15.4 fantasy points. And it's very obvious at this point that the Bears are making more of an effort to get the 9th overall pick involved in this offense. And in 2 games since Chicago's week 7 bye, Rome has earned a 22% target share, 35% air yard share, along with 2.13 yards per route run, 18-yard ADOT. Rome somehow leads this Bears wide receiver room in receiving yards with 391. Yeah, it's not a lot of receiving yards. This offense as a whole as of late has been really bad. DJ Moore has been really bad. Keenan Allen looks old and washed at this point. Caleb Williams hasn't been great. It is a little concerning because this offense overall under Shane Waldron has been a massive disappointment, and it just looks like a complete mess at this point. But I will say, I feel like they're going to get it going at any moment now, and it's looking like Odunze is going to be a big part of that moving forward. And I'm assuming DJ Moore is going to see a lot of stud corner Christian Gonzalez in this one, which is probably going to leave Rome in some advantageous positions. And it's a favorable matchup as well, as New England is allowing the 12th most fantasy points per game to perimeter receivers. So if you're in a desperation spot with 4 teams on bye, I really like Rome this week and going forward. Moving on to Jaylen Waddle. Yes, I know. Waddle has been a complete bust in fantasy this year, especially for a guy that you spent a round 3, round 4 pick on. And a lot of it could be blamed on Tua missing 4 games with that concussion. But Waddle still hasn't really done much, even with Tua under center. We're still waiting for that big blow-up game from Jaylen, and we just haven't seen it. Over the last 2 weeks, with a healthy Tua, Jaylen has combined for 6 catches, 41 yards, a touchdown, and 16.1 fantasy points. Thank the Lord he got into the end zone last week, because if not, this would be embarrassing at this point. This is really hard to swallow because Waddle is just such a talented player. We know how good this offense is, but these are just not numbers that you expected when you drafted Waddle this offseason. And a big reason for Waddle's decline in production has been Jonnu Smith is getting, for some reason, heavily involved in this offense, as well as Devon Achane has been really involved in this passing game this year, which has hurt Waddle. He's like the number 4 option right now. It's Tyreek Hill, it's Achane, it's Smith, and then Waddle. It's just been really weird. Did not see this coming whatsoever, but let's not lose hope just yet. I don't think Waddle should be on your bench this week, especially with 4 teams on bye in a really nice matchup on deck. I know, at this point, you're probably frustrated. You probably just don't want to start him because let's be honest, he's done nothing this year. There's no reason to start him. There's nothing to get excited about. But looking at the matchup against the Rams, who have allowed the 4th most points per game to perimeter receivers, and this is the defense that just gave up 180 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns to Jackson Smith-Njigba last week. Yes, JSN was all they really had in the passing game with Metcalf out. So you could argue that Waddle isn't the only guy in this offense, obviously, that we just talked about. But I expect this game to be high scoring. I think Waddle is going to have one of those huge signature games, and he's just one of those guys that you can't keep on your bench. While his floor is pretty low, his ceiling is still really high in my opinion. Mark it down, book it. I think Waddle has his best game of the season in week 10 and needs to be in starting lineups if you have him on your team. Last guy up here is Jameson Williams. His breakout campaign came to a screeching halt after getting suspended for the last 2 games due to his use of PEDs. Not great, but has now been reinstated and could go crazy in his first game back. He is the wide receiver 32 in fantasy points per game, but he has scored 14.4 fantasy points in 4 out of 6 games, 21.2 yards per reception, which is the 3rd best in the NFL. And JMO is a dangerous deep threat that can score from anywhere on the field. We know this on a good offense. You can't bench guys that are on a top 3 offense in what figures to be a high scoring contest against the Houston Texans, as this game is the 3rd highest projected point total on the week. Even though Houston probably won't have Nico Collins, I think Joe Mixon, CJ Stroud, Tank Dell will be able to get it done against this defense. The matchup is just too good. The talent's there. The situation is perfect. And the Texans have given up the 5th most fantasy points per game to receivers this season. So all that being said, Williams is a must start for me in week 10. I do have a couple honorable mentions that we'll run through here really quick. Jordan Addison, Amari Cooper, Xavier Legette, and Jaylen Warren. These are all guys who I think are kind of flying under the radar. Sneaky starts, sleeper starts that need to be in your lineup if you're in a pinch with injuries, 4 teams on bye. Those are some other guys that I really like in week 10. Now on to some scary sits. These are some bigger name players that you might want to consider benching if you are able to. Let's start with Marvin Harrison Jr., who has had a very rocky rookie season, wide receiver 38 in fantasy points per game. He's a guy we've talked about in the past that he's so inconsistent. He's so up and down. You don't really know when to start him or bench him. And he's a guy that probably needs to be started every single week. But maybe this is more of temper your expectations, because like we talked about with 4 teams on bye, you probably can't bench Harrison. But if you have a stacked, loaded roster, then I would consider it, as Marvin has not drawn a red zone target since week 4. Kyler Murray has also been all over the map with his play. One week he looks really good. The other week you're like, what is this dude doing? So that also makes this difficult, because if Murray's playing poorly, then that's not going to help Marvin out whatsoever. And Harrison has scored less than 6 fantasy points in 4 out of his last 5 games. To be fair, one of those games was in week 6 where he left early against the Packers due to that concussion. So we can throw that one away, but any way you slice it, it's been a disappointing year so far for the 4th overall pick. Marvin still doesn't appear to be on the same page as Murray, as he's averaged just 5.5 targets per game over the last 6 weeks. Like I said, you likely have to start Harrison, but I would be tempering expectations just because he hasn't been playing well at times, and the matchup against the Jets is brutal, as they have allowed the fewest points per game to receivers. So if you can get away from Harrison, if you can leave him on your bench, I would do it. But again, we've seen tough matchups for Marvin, like against the Dolphins, where he still can perform well. He still can rack up fantasy points. So that being said, I don't blame you if you leave him in your starting lineup, but just proceed with caution, as it could be a tough game for him in week 10. Next guy up that you might want to consider benching if you do have a better option, and that's Tony Pollard, who has been a workhorse for the Titans this season, as Pollard has seen 20 plus carries in each of his last 2 games, but might see a little bit of a decreased role this week with Tajay Spears set to return, who has been dealing with that hamstring injury over the last couple of weeks. Nonetheless, Pollard has been fantastic this year, even on a bad Tennessee offense, and is the RB19 in fantasy, 7th in yards after contact per attempt, along with double-digit fantasy points in 6 out of 8 games. So like I said, probably makes it hard to bench him, but if you do have a better option, I would consider it against the Chargers, who are very stingy against the run, allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position. So get away from Pollard in week 10 if you are able to. Next man up is Courtland Sutton, who is on an absolute heater right now with Bo Nix finally starting to play better. Sutton has been the main beneficiary of that in the passing game, as he ranks third in deep targets and red zone targets, along with a 22% target share, 30% first read share, and has now put together back-to-back monster performances. In week 8, he had 8 receptions, 100 receiving yards, 17.1 fantasy points, and in week 9, 7 receptions, 122 yards, 23.2 fantasy points. I will say though, both matchups were pretty easy against bottom 5 pass defenses in Carolina and Baltimore, so we shouldn't get too carried away here. I wouldn't say Sutton is a must-start guy moving forward, and I would be steering away from him this week against the Kansas City Chiefs, who are just one of the best defenses in football at this point, and they are allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to perimeter receivers. So if you can pivot off Sutton, I would be doing it, because I don't know how much I trust Bo Nix yet. And in a matchup against the Chiefs is less than ideal. So get away from Courtland in week 10 if you can. Last guy up that I would be benching if I were you, and that's Rico Gathers, who is coming off a really nice game in week 9. We know Zeke was not active in this one, but Rico had 12 carries, 75 yards, along with 5 receptions for 32 yards. He got into the end zone on that nice catch that he bobbled, fell into his lap, 21.7 fantasy points, along with a 71% snap share. If only Dallas was smart enough to give him this usage every single week. He's far and away the most talented running back on this roster. I don't even know why they brought Zeke back. Like, it just makes no sense. This franchise, this ownership is just an absolute disaster. And I'm afraid that this type of performance from Rico may never happen again this year, especially with Dak out for potentially the rest of the year with that very serious hamstring injury, a banged up CeeDee Lamb. This Cowboy offense is just not going to be able to move the football very well with Cooper Rush under center. Yes, he's one of the better backups in the league, but still, I would not be starting any Cowboy in your lineup this week if you can help it. You probably have to have Lamb in your lineup, but that is about it. This Eagles defense is legit, and they're really good at stopping the run, as they've allowed the 3rd fewest rushing yards per game. So Rico, even though he's coming off a really nice game, you have no Dak. Zeke is probably going to be back, and they're just going to struggle to move the football with no quarterback and not many weapons on offense, which means they're not going to be in scoring position often. Rico has to be on your bench this week. It's just a really bad situation against a really good Eagles defense. That's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. If you took away anything from the video, if you could please like the video, subscribe to the channel. It helps me out more than you know, and I will see you in the next one.